Hi everyone, welcome to another Writing Support Center workshop. My name is Giselle, and today's topic is tips for developing body paragraphs. In this workshop, we will be discussing some techniques that you can use to help you write and develop your body paragraphs. So if you've taken a workshop with the Writing Support Center before, this slide might seem familiar to you. And if that's the case, you can go ahead and skip forward. If not, if this is your first time taking a Writing Support Center workshop, I do have a few tips for you so that you can get the most out of this workshop. The first tip I have is to download the worksheet. Wherever you access this workshop, there should be a link to a worksheet, both a PDF and a doc version. Feel free to download the version that works best for you. You do not need to download both of them. This worksheet is going to help you work through the workshop, and you'll be completing different exercises as we go through the workshop. The second tip I have for you is to take your time. Since this is a recorded workshop, you can pause and rewind as you need to. So, if there's a point in the workshop that gets a little unclear, if there's a point where you need to stop to do one of the activities, if there's anything like that, you can go ahead and pause. And if you just need to clarify a point, feel free to rewind. So today's goals, I have three of them for you as you complete this workshop. The first is to provide tips that will help you develop your body paragraphs logically, clearly, and purposefully. This workshop is meant to help simplify the process of writing those body paragraphs. The second tip is to provide you with a 5-step process for writing a paragraph, a body paragraph specifically. So these 5 steps, again, should help simplify the process and help clarify the process of writing a body paragraph if you've had difficulty with it in the past. And lastly, you're going to practice writing your own body paragraph. So at the end, you will be given a chance to practice what you've learned in this workshop by working on a current essay or an essay that you're revising. So before we begin talking about body paragraphs, I wanted to start with an opening reflection. I want you to think about your current process for writing body paragraphs. How do you decide what to put in your body paragraphs? What are some elements every body paragraph needs? Now, this is just a question to see where you are at in terms of writing body paragraphs. There's no right or wrong answers. It's just a way for you to reflect. So go ahead and answer that question or those questions on your worksheet and continue once you're done with that. You can keep pausing if you're still not done. If you are done, go ahead and continue. So to summarize quickly, body paragraphs are the building blocks of your paper. What that means is the unity and coherence of your ideas is what constitutes a paragraph. Again, if something is building upon one another, you want to make sure those body paragraphs connect in some way, and not only connect to each other, but connect to your argument, your thesis statement, and your conclusion. Everything in an essay builds upon each other. So many students actually define paragraphs in terms of length. That would be an incorrect assumption. A paragraph is more than just a long body of writing. It's a it's in, you should instead think of it as a organized piece of writing that unifies sentences by a claim or a topic sentence that supports one main idea. While a body paragraph is usually 5 to 7 sentences long, it can vary depending on the type of body paragraph you're writing or the type of essay you're writing. But a rule of thumb is 5 to 7 sentences long. And again, it should be unified by a claim that supports a main idea. A thesis functions like a seed from which your paper and your ideas will grow. Your body paragraphs are where you grow these ideas. So you give a thesis in your introduction paragraph, but as you go through the body, you're explaining deeply as to why you are arguing what you're arguing. They're the supports to your thesis. That's how you want to think of body paragraphs. So to begin, I want to give you a basic paragraph structure, which is called the pie paragraph structure. It's a three element paragraph structure. So three things make it up, which is why we have the acronym PI. But the first thing you want in a body paragraph is a basic claim. So in writing, this is most often your topic sentence. After you have your topic sentence or your basic claim, you then want to provide the information. So that information is the evidence that supports a claim. In writing, this is most often quotations, paraphrases, or summaries. After you've provided both your point and information, you then move into your explanation, which is your analysis, elaboration, or interpretation of the point and information. In writing, this is where you make connections back to your topic, sentence, and thesis. So this is just a basic three-element structure of a paragraph. It's just to get you to understand how a paragraph typically flows, but I'm going to give you 5 steps that you can follow when crafting your sentences in a paragraph. So as I said, I'm going to review a 5-step process for developing paragraphs. For each step, there's going to be an explanation and an example. The example that we're building out will be about gender studies and feminism, but you should get the general idea of what makes up a paragraph from this example. So I gave you the thesis just so you understand what the body paragraph is supporting, and that thesis is: through a genealogy of feminist theory, we can see how understandings of gender have informed one another and consequently grown throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. So that's the sample thesis we're going with, and the body paragraph you're going to see with the 5 steps is supporting this thesis. So just keep that in mind. So the first step you want to do when creating a body paragraph is to decide on a controlling idea and create a topic sentence. So this is a point in the pie paragraph structure that I just showed you. Step 1 is just to figure out what your idea is for that paragraph and write that topic sentence. The controlling idea or point that directs the paragraph's development is what you can think of it as. It often appears in the form of a topic sentence. An example I have here is Judith Butler's book, Gender Trouble, was published in 1990 and has proved to be a seminal text in the realm of gender theory. So from that topic sentence, what I understand is that this paragraph is going to talk about the ideas in that book, Gender Trouble, and it's going to talk about its place in the realm of gender theory. So I clearly understand what the paragraph is going to be about, and I also see its connection back to the thesis, which is it's part of the genealogy of feminist theory and how that idea from Judith Butler has informed our understanding of gender. So it's very clear to me with this topic sentence what the paragraph is going to be about. Step 2, you want to explain that controlling idea. So you want to explain further, more specifically, what your paragraph is going to be about. After you write the controlling idea / topic sentence / claim, you will need to provide an explanation of your thinking about the main topic for the reader. This will help them interpret the information presented in the idea. You need this because your reader can interpret the first sentence anyway, in many ways. So your second sentence is going to specify what you want your reader to understand about your paragraph. So this example would be the second sentence in the paragraph, which is more specifically, Butler's notion of gender performativity calls attention to the way gender norms have come to define dominant understandings of men and women. So what the writer is doing is getting more specific and explaining to me what part of the controlling idea they're going to explain in the paragraph. Sometimes explaining the idea is summarizing the main points of the text you're writing about. So what that means is if you are writing about a text, you want to summarize the points you want the reader to understand. So you don't need to summarize the entire text you're writing about. You just want to highlight the points that the reader needs in order to understand your argument. And in this case, the point that the writer wants the reader to understand is the definition of gender and gender performativity. So with step 3, you want to finally give an example. Paragraph development progresses with some type of support or evidence for the idea and the explanation that came before it. Usually this comes in the form of a paraphrase, a quote, or any form of evidence that you have. Generally, if you're writing a paper for an English class, this is going to be a quotation mark. A quotation from a text or a reading that you are using for your paper. So an example of this is, she claims that gender is a stylized repetition of acts that copy what society understands as naturalized acts associated with biological sex. However, what society understands as natural is actually an act that's been going on before one arrived on the scene. So the writer provides evidence from the text, and it's what's in quotation marks. Notice how the writer didn't just drop in the quotation. They explained it and connected it to the main idea of the paragraph. So for me as a reader, I understand how to interpret the evidence because they set it up for me in step 2. So generally, when you provide a quote, you also want to provide the citation. So in this case, this is MLA style citation. But I think one thing that's also important to notice is that there's 2 sentences here. So while you want to keep the quotation short, this person broke up the quote, which is why it's okay for them to have 2 sentences. It also communicates that each of these steps doesn't mean you're only going to have 1 sentence. Say for step 1, you might just have 1 topic sentence, but you might need to explain the controlling idea in 2 sentences. In this case, the person needed 2 sentences to explain or to provide the quotation. So keep that in mind. Each step doesn't necessarily mean it's 1 sentence per step. You can certainly interpret it that way, but sometimes you might need an extra sentence. And in this case, the writer needed 1 extra sentence to further explain the quote. Step 4, you want to explain the example. So this explanation shows readers why you chose to use this particular example as evidence to support the topic sentence claim controlling idea in your paragraph. So this is when you're telling your reader, hey, this is how you should interpret the quote. This is how it's related to my main point. An example, thus, gender is only made real through the repetitive acts of long established and oppressive gender norms, leading to the falsely innate categories of men and women. So in the first part of this quote, thus, gender is only made real through the repetitive acts of long established and oppressive gender norms. That is how they interpreted the quote, and that's how they're explaining it to the reader. So that's really important. You never want to just drop in a quote. You want to make sure you're explaining why it's important for your argument. The second half of the sentence, leading to the falsely innate categories of men and women, links it back to the beginning of the paragraph. Not that. Which is when the writer wrote, calls attention to the way gender norms have come to define dominant understandings of men and women. So you can see the writer is connecting their quote back to the main point of their paragraph, which is really important. You want to show how the example supports your ideas in the paragraph. You never want to provide a quote just as a way to summarize a text. You always want to provide it with intention, with an intention to explain how it supports your main argument or your main topic of the paragraph. And finally, step 5, you want to complete the paragraph's idea or transition into the next paragraph. So the final movement in paragraph development involves tying up the loose ends of the paragraph and reminding the reader of the relevance of the information in this paragraph to the thesis of the paper. You can also simply transition your reader to the next development in the next paragraph. So you can do both of these things, but the author of this paragraph did you can do both, or you can do one of these things, and the author of this paragraph decided to do both of these things. So for example, while Butler clarifies the socially constructed nature of gender, women of color feminism calls attention to an issue with Butler's understanding of gender. It fails to recognize intersectionality and how race and class are also integral to understanding oppression. So, in the first part of the paragraph or sentence, the person writes, while Butler clarifies the socially constructed nature of gender. So, they're explaining what Butler does in that quote. Again, linking it back to the main idea of the paragraph. And then they point to what they're going to talk about in the next paragraph, which is, I'm assuming, women of color feminism and theory, and how it acknowledges race and class. So I get that from this sentence. I understand how the ideas are connected to the main argument in the paragraph and in the essay, but I also understand what they're going to talk about in the next paragraph and how the two ideas are linked. So your concluding sentence, like I said, can connect your reader to the next paragraph, or it can just be a simple connection to the thesis again to remind your reader of how this paragraph supports your thesis. Either way, as long as you're wrapping up the loose ends in the paragraph, that's what matters most. All right, so for this activity, I want you to think about these two paragraphs. One is an original version of a paragraph, and the second is a revised version of a body paragraph. I want you to think, how does the revised version improve on the original? I also want you to think about what makes the revised paragraph more developed than the original. So considering what we just talked about through steps 1 through 5, apply that knowledge to your reading of these paragraphs and see how the revised improves. You can do that on your worksheet, and when you're done, you can continue with the video. All right, so I hope you had enough time. If not, please continue pausing. I do want to point to some differences that I noticed and why I find the revised version more developed. The first thing is that the revised version added a topic sentence that I assume connects the paragraph to the thesis. So while I don't know the thesis of this paragraph, um, what thesis this body paragraph is informing, I can see that this person did add an extra, or not an extra, but a topic sentence, whereas the original did not have one. So the topic sentence is, as the United States has grown increasingly multi-ethnic, racial difference and subsequent racialization have differed throughout history. I would assume this connects the paragraph to the thesis, which clears it up a lot. The second thing that the revised version does is it adds a clear example in the form of a quote, which replaces the general "some scholars believe race is socially constructed," which makes the argument stronger. So this sentence, in racial formation, Michael Omin Howard would not state that there is a continuous temptation to think of race as an essence, as something fixed, concrete, and objective. So this is much more impactful because it's an actual quote from scholars in the field, versus this just says some scholars, and I don't know how to interpret that because it's so general. So always opt for more specific evidence that supports your argument. The second thing that the revised version does is it clarifies how the reader should understand the evidence and how it connects with their argument. So in the first paragraph, they say, this is their evidence. Some scholars believe race is socially constructed. And they say, however, race is neither fixed nor stagnant, and views that claim that such must be challenged, right? So I don't really understand the purpose of this sentence. It is unclear because it's not supporting a quote. Versus this explanation, from this we can understand that factors that define a race are neither fixed nor stagnant. So in that quote, they're explaining to me how I should interpret the evidence and how the evidence links to their main argument. Another thing that the revised version does is it adds a detail to the conclusion sentence that gives me an idea of what the next paragraph will explain. So in the original version, it says, therefore, we can understand race as a social construction that constantly changes. While they're trying to connect the idea back to the main point in the paragraph, it's unclear because I didn't really understand that. The writer didn't explain that to me. So even though they're trying to connect it, there's no clear connection. Versus if you look at this sentence, therefore, we can understand race as a social construction that constantly changes in order to meet the needs and objective of those who define racial categories, which are those in power. So again, this paragraph or this sentence is tying the loose ends in the paragraph by summarizing or highlighting the main ideas of the paragraph, and also pointing to what they're going to talk about in their next paragraph, which is talking about who holds that power of racial categories and defining those racial categories. So I can see a clear connection between ideas, even though I can't see the next paragraph. I can assume, though, how the argument's going to flow because their train of thought is so clear to me and they build out the ideas for the reader. So keep that in mind as you're writing. Again, you can use steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 to help you write your own body paragraphs. As I said, those steps aren't necessarily one sentence per step, but it can be if that helps you write a little bit more simple, helps you just get the formula down. But those 5 steps will lead to stronger body paragraphs. Lastly, we're going to work on an activity for practicing writing your own body paragraph. So for this activity, you're simply going to revise or write a body paragraph for an essay you are currently assigned. So if you aren't working on something, go ahead and pull up one of your old essays and pick a paragraph you feel like you can improve upon. If not, write a whole new one using the new formula. You're going to write that on the worksheet, and once you're done, you will continue with the workshop. All right, so I hope you all found this workshop useful. These are the sources I used during the workshop, and they are also going to be linked in the chat transcript so that you can copy and paste the links if you want to learn a bit more about body paragraphs. If you have any questions or if you want to learn more about the writing process, feel free to visit the Writing Support Center and receive tutoring. You can receive tutoring through Zoom and email consultations. Thank you for attending this workshop, and we hope to see you at the next one.